When they told me my baby was dead, I did not hear the rest of what they said. I remember the ceiling above my bed. White. Too white. I remember the smell of medicine and something sharp in the air. A nurse was speaking. Her voice was soft, careful. The kind of voice people use when they think you might break. She said there were complications. She said the baby did not survive. She said I should rest. Rest. I had just given birth. My body was shaking. My arms were empty. How do you rest when your arms are empty? I asked one question. Only one. Can I see him? There was a pause. A small one. But pauses carry truth. No, she said gently. It's better this way. That sentence followed me for 30 years. I was 22 years old when I became a mother. And the same day, I became a woman who lost a child. At least, that is what I was told. The labor was long, painful, confusing. I remember crying out for my baby before anyone told me anything. I remember the silence that followed. No cry, no movement. Just people moving quickly around me. Someone said my name. Someone held my hand. And then they told me my baby was gone. I did not scream. I did not faint. I stared at my hands and thought, this cannot be real. Mothers know when their child is alive. That thought came to me then, quietly. But I pushed it away. Because everyone around me was so sure. They told me not to ask questions. They said it would only hurt more. They said sometimes babies are born too weak. Sometimes hearts stop. They said it was nobody's fault. They said many things. But they did not give me my baby. There was no body to hold. No face to remember. Just a story they asked me to accept. I went home 2 days later. Without a child. The crib was already there. The tiny clothes folded neatly. I sat on the bed and stared at them for hours. People came to visit. They brought sympathy. They brought silence. Everyone avoided looking at the crib. I learned very quickly that my grief made people uncomfortable. So I learned to be quiet. At night, I felt something strange. An emptiness that was not just emotional. It was physical. My arms felt heavy. My body felt confused. My milk came in. My body believed my baby was alive. I cried in the bathroom so no one would hear me. I whispered apologies to a child I was told no longer existed. Years passed. Life moved on the way it always does, even when you beg it to stop. I married again. I built a life. But there was always a quiet space inside me. A space shaped like a child. I never forgot the date. I never forgot the weight of that silence. And deep down, in a place I never spoke about, I carried a question I was afraid to ask. What if they were wrong? 30 years later, on an ordinary evening, someone knocked on my door. I was not expecting anyone. When I opened it, a man stood there. Tall. Nervous. Holding a folded piece of paper. He looked at me like he had been searching for my face his entire life. And then he said something that stopped my heart. I think you're my mother. My knees felt weak, but I did not move. I stood there holding the door, staring at the man in front of me, trying to understand what my ears had just heard. My mother. No one had called me that in this way for 30 years. I'm sorry, I said slowly. I think you have the wrong house. He shook his head. I don't think so, he said. His voice was calm, but his hands were shaking. I've been looking for you for a long time. I looked at his face again. The shape of his eyes. The way his mouth tightened when he was nervous. Something inside me shifted. Not recognition. Not yet. But a feeling. A quiet pull. May I come in? He asked. I hesitated. Every part of me wanted to close the door. Not because I was angry, but because hope felt dangerous. Still, I stepped aside. He walked in slowly, like someone afraid the ground might disappear under his feet. We stood in the living room, facing each other. Neither of us sat down. "I don't want to scare you," he said. I need to tell you why I'm here." I nodded, unable to speak. "I was adopted," he said. "I always knew that. My parents told me when I was young." He paused. "They also told me my birth mother was very young, that there were complications at birth, that I was given up immediately." My chest felt tight. "They said my records were sealed," he continued. "But I never stopped wondering." I sat down then. My legs could not hold me anymore. He stayed standing, respectful. "Last year," he said, "I finally found a name. Yours." My heart began to pound. "No," I whispered. "That's not possible." He reached into his pocket and unfolded the paper he had been holding. "I was born at St. Mary's Hospital," he said, "on March 14th. 30 years ago." That was the date. The date burned into my memory. My hands began to shake. He placed the paper gently on the table between us. "I don't want anything from you," he said. "I just needed to know where I came from." I stared at the paper but did not touch it. For 30 years, I had lived believing my baby died. And now a man stood in my living room, telling me he had lived instead. "I was told my baby was dead," I said quietly. His face changed. "They told you that?" he asked. I nodded. Silence filled the room. "That's what they told my adoptive parents too," he said slowly. "That my birth mother didn't survive childbirth." I looked up sharply. "What?" "They said she died," he continued. "That I was the only one who lived." The room seemed to tilt. Both of us had been told lies. Different ones, but lies all the same. I felt tears rise, but they did not fall. "I asked to see him," I said. "They said it was better not to." He swallowed. "My parents said the same thing about you," he said. "They told me not to search, that it would only bring pain." We looked at each other then, really looked. 30 years of silence stood between us. "I don't even know your name," I said. "My name is Daniel," he replied. "But I don't know what name you would have given me." That broke something open inside me. I stood up slowly and walked toward him. I reached out, then stopped. "May I?" I asked. He nodded. I placed my hand on his arm. Warm, solid, alive. I had imagined this touch 1,000 times in my dreams. Never like this. Not real. "I thought about you every day," I whispered. "Even when I pretended I didn't." His eyes filled with tears. "So did I," he said. We stood there for a long time. Not hugging. Not speaking. Just breathing in the same space. Finally, he said, "I don't want to overwhelm you. I can leave if you want." I shook my head. "No," I said. "Please stay." We sat down together. He told me about his childhood. A loving home. Parents who cared for him deeply. "They were good to me," he said quickly. "I don't want you to think otherwise." "I'm glad," I said honestly. "I prayed for that, even when I didn't know where you were." That surprised him. "You prayed for me?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "I prayed you were at peace, even if I believed you were gone." We talked until the evening light faded. He told me he worked as a teacher, that he had a family of his own. "You're a grandmother," he said gently. The word landed softly. Grandmother. I smiled through tears. "I don't know how to do this," I said. "Neither do I," he replied. "But we can take it slowly." That felt right. Before he left, he stood at the door and turned back. "Thank you for opening the door," he said. I know that couldn't have been easy. After he left, I sat alone in the living room. The house felt different. Not loud. Not chaotic. Alive. For 30 years, I had grieved a child I thought I lost. That night, I realized something quietly powerful. My baby had lived. And now, so would I. That night, I did not sleep. Not because I was afraid. Not because I was overwhelmed. But because my mind could not accept what my heart already knew. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face standing at my door. Not as a baby, as a man. Alive. For 30 years, my grief had a shape. It was familiar. Heavy, but known. Now that shape was gone. And in its place was something fragile. Hope. Hope scared me more than grief ever did. Grief does not change. Hope asks you to believe again. I lay in bed listening to the quiet house. The same house that had held my pain for decades. Now it held a truth I never imagined touching. I kept hearing his voice. I think you're my mother. No one had ever said that to me before. Not in this way. Not with certainty. I pressed my hand against my chest and tried to slow my breathing. My body felt strange. Heavy and light at the same time. The next morning, I woke up early. The sun had not fully risen yet. The sky was pale. I sat at the kitchen table and stared at the empty chair across from me. For years, that chair represented absence. Now it represented possibility. I did not know what to do with that. I made tea and forgot to drink it. I watched steam rise and disappear. So much of my life felt like that. Moments rising and fading before I knew how to hold them. I wondered if he had slept at all. If his mind was also racing. If he was afraid I would change my mind. That thought made my chest tighten. I did not want him to think that. Around mid-morning, my phone rang. I stared at it before answering. It was his name. Daniel. Seeing it on my screen felt unreal. "Hello," I said. "Hi," he replied softly. "I just wanted to check if you were okay." I smiled despite myself. "I'm not sure," I said honestly. "But I'm here." "I understand," he said. "I didn't sleep either." That made me feel less alone. We spoke carefully. About small things. How he got home safely. How the weather felt cooler than expected. Neither of us mentioned the bigger truth. It was too large to touch so soon. Before we hung up, he said something that stayed with me. "I don't want to rush anything," he said. "But I hope we can talk again." "Yes," I replied. "I hope so too." When the call ended, I sat quietly. For the first time in 30 years, my grief had an answer. Not an explanation. An answer. As the days passed, we spoke more often. Sometimes for 10 minutes. Sometimes longer. We learned each other slowly. I learned he loved cooking. That he enjoyed quiet mornings. That he carried a small scar on his hand from childhood. I told him about my life. About the years that followed his birth. About the way I learned to live with silence. I did not tell him everything at once. Some truths need space. One afternoon, he asked a question I had been expecting. "Can you tell me about the day I was born?" he asked gently. I closed my eyes. "I can try," I said. I told him about the hospital room. The pain. The confusion. I told him how I begged to see him. How they told me it was better not to. I told him about going home with empty arms. There was a long silence after I finished. "I'm so sorry," he said finally. "For what?" I asked. "For what they took from you," he replied. "And from both of us." That was when I understood something. He was grieving too. Not for a mother he never knew. But for a truth he never had. A week later, he came to visit again. This time, when I opened the door, I did not feel the urge to step back. I stepped forward. We hugged. It was awkward, careful, but it was real. I felt his heartbeat. Steady. I had dreamed of holding my child again. Never like this. Not grown. Not taller than me. Yet somehow, it felt right. We sat in the living room and talked for hours. He showed me photographs. His childhood. His wedding. His children. I looked at those pictures with wonder. A life I never saw. A life that existed anyway. You didn't miss everything, he said quietly. You're here now. I nodded. Yes, I said. I am. That evening, after he left, I sat alone again. But the house did not feel empty. It felt full of echoes. Not painful ones. Living ones. For 30 years, I believed my baby had died at birth. Now I knew the truth. He had lived. And the greatest miracle was not that he knocked on my door. It was that I was still here to open it. Over the next few weeks, my life began to settle into a new rhythm, one I never imagined I would have at this age. Not rushed. Not loud. Careful. Daniel did not come every day. And I was grateful for that. We both understood that 30 years of absence could not be filled with daily conversations. Some spaces needed air. Some truths needed time to sit quietly before they could be touched again. When he did visit, we kept things simple. Tea. Soft conversation. Long pauses that did not feel uncomfortable. I watched him closely when he spoke, not because I doubted him, but because I was still learning the shape of him. The way he listened. The way he chose his words. The way his eyes softened when he talked about his children. I saw pieces of myself in him. And sometimes, painfully, pieces of the baby I never held long enough to remember. One afternoon, as we sat near the window, he asked me something gently. Did you ever name me? I felt my throat tighten. Yes, I said. I did. He waited. I named you Samuel, I continued. I don't know why. It just felt right. He smiled slowly. My middle name is Samuel, he said. The room went still. My adoptive mother gave it to me, he added. She said she felt like it belonged to me. Tears came then. Quiet ones. Some things cannot be explained. They are simply felt. As days turned into months, the story of my life began to feel less broken and more layered. I stopped thinking of the past as something stolen from me. I began thinking of it as something unfinished. Not erased. Not corrected. Just continuing. Daniel introduced me to his wife one afternoon. She was kind. Careful. She did not seem threatened. Only respectful. I've heard so much about you, she said softly. I nodded, unsure what to say. Later, Daniel told me he had spoken to her long before coming to my door. She said the truth belongs to you too, he told me. And that I should knock. I thanked her silently for that courage. Meeting my grandchildren was another kind of miracle. They did not see me as a stranger. They saw me as someone new. Someone to ask questions. Someone to listen. They called me by my name at first. Then one day, without asking, one of them said, Grandma. I did not correct her. Some titles arrive when they are ready. There were difficult moments too. Moments when grief returned, unexpectedly. Like when I watched Daniel comfort his child the way I once imagined comforting mine. Or when I realized how many birthdays I had missed. On those days, I allowed myself to feel sad. I did not rush myself toward gratitude. Grief and joy can exist in the same space. I had learned that now. One evening, Daniel asked me if I was angry. Sometimes, I said honestly. But not at you. He nodded. I'm angry at the silence, I continued. at the decisions made without my voice. He understood. So am I, he said. That shared anger did not pull us apart. It brought clarity. As time passed, I began to notice how my body responded to all this. I slept better. I breathed deeper. The constant tightness in my chest loosened. For years, my body had held grief even when my mind tried to be strong. Now, my body was learning something new. Relief. One quiet morning, I stood in the doorway and watched Daniel walk toward his car after a visit. He turned and waved. I waved back. Not with longing. Not with regret. With acceptance. Our relationship was not meant to replace the past. It was meant to honor it. I often think about that night 30 years ago. The hospital room. The silence. The words that changed everything. I used to think that night defined me. Now I understand something different. It shaped me. But it did not end me. If someone had told me years ago that my child would return to me as a grown man, I would not have believed them. Not because it was impossible, but because I had learned not to hope for things that felt too big. Yet here I was, living a truth that arrived late, but arrived nonetheless. This story is not about correcting the past. It is about learning how to live when the past changes. It is about opening a door even when your hands are shaking. It is about discovering that love does not disappear when it is separated from you. It waits. Quietly. For 30 years, I carried the belief that my baby died at birth. Then one day, he knocked on my door. And in that moment, my life did not restart. It continued. Gently. As that continuation settled into my days, I began to notice how carefully my heart was learning to trust again. Not in a sudden way. Not with excitement. In a quiet, steady way. For a long time, I had protected myself by expecting very little. Loss had taught me that expecting too much could break you. Now, slowly, expectation returned. Not as hope for miracles, but as belief in ordinary moments. I believed we would talk again. I believed he would come back. I believed I would be okay if he didn't. That balance felt new. Daniel and I began creating small traditions without naming them as such. He visited on Sunday afternoons when his family schedule allowed. We drank tea. We sat near the window. Sometimes we spoke about his children's school. Sometimes about recipes. Sometimes we said very little at all. Silence between us no longer felt like absence. It felt like understanding. One afternoon, he brought an old photo album. I thought you might want to see this, he said. We sat together on the couch as he opened it. Pictures of his childhood. Holidays. School events. I studied each photo carefully, as if trying to recognize the baby I never held. In one picture, he was about 5 years old, smiling with missing teeth. I touched the page gently. You look happy, I said. I was, he replied. They loved me. Those words mattered. Knowing he had been loved did not erase my pain, but it softened it. As the months passed, people around me began to notice changes. Friends told me I looked lighter, that my voice sounded calmer. They did not know why, and I did not always explain. Some truths are sacred. They do not belong to everyone. One evening, Daniel asked me something unexpected. Do you ever wish you had searched for me? He asked. I thought about it carefully. I did, I said. Many times. He waited. But I was told you were gone, I continued. And I chose to survive instead. He nodded slowly. That makes sense, he said. There was no blame in his voice. Only understanding. Meeting his wife again deepened that understanding. She spoke to me openly. I was afraid at first, she admitted. Not of you. Of the pain this might bring. I was afraid too, I replied. She smiled gently. But I see now that truth doesn't destroy families, she said. Silence does. Her words stayed with me. One day, while sitting alone, I realized something quietly powerful. For 30 years, I had defined myself as a woman who lost a child. Now, I was a woman who had found him again. But more than that, I was a woman who had survived both. That felt important. There were still moments when grief returned sharply, like when I imagined his first steps, his first words. Moments I never witnessed. On those days, I allowed myself to mourn what I missed. I did not force myself to feel grateful. Healing does not require pretending pain never existed. It requires honesty. As time went on, Daniel began calling me Mom more often. At first, it startled me. Then it warmed me. The word carried weight. History. Love. I did not ask him to say it. He chose it. That choice mattered. One afternoon, he told me about a medical record he had recently accessed. There were notes about my birth, he said quietly. Things that don't match what either of us was told. My chest tightened. They never wanted questions, I said. He nodded. But I think they never expected answers to surface, he replied. We did not go further that day. Some doors open slowly. Some truths arrive in layers. I noticed how my body responded to all of this. I breathed easier. I laughed more freely. The constant ache I carried for decades softened. Not disappeared. Softened. For years, I had carried grief as proof of love. Now, love no longer needed proof. It simply existed. One evening, as Daniel was leaving, he paused at the door. I'm glad you're here, he said. So am I replied. And for the first time in 30 years, those words felt complete. This story was never about correcting the past. It was about learning how to live when the truth arrives late. It was about discovering that even the deepest loss can shift shape. And that sometimes, what you thought was gone forever was only waiting for the right moment to return. Quietly. As our connection grew steadier, I noticed something else changing quietly inside me. I stopped apologizing for my feelings. For years, whenever sadness came, I treated it like a weakness. I pushed it away. I hid it behind busy hands and quiet smiles. Now, when sadness arrived, I let it sit with me for a while. Not to take over. Just to be acknowledged. Daniel noticed this too. One afternoon, he said, You don't rush through your emotions anymore. I smiled. I spent too many years rushing just to survive, I said. Now I want to actually live. He nodded, understanding more than words could explain. We began talking about ordinary memories. Not about what was lost, but about what was found. He told me about the first time he learned to ride a bicycle. How he fell and scraped his knee. How his adoptive father carried him inside. I listened carefully, imagining the scene without pain. Not wishing I had been there. Just accepting that someone else had been. That acceptance surprised me. It did not feel like giving up. It felt like maturity. There were moments when he asked about my life too. What were you like when you were younger? He asked once. I laughed softly. I was afraid of everything, I said. And hopeful about everything at the same time. He smiled. That sounds like me, he said. I saw myself in him then. Not in his face, but in his temperament. That felt deeper. One evening, as we sat together, he said something gently. I don't feel like I missed you anymore, he said. I feel like I found you. That sentence settled in my heart. Loss turns into longing when it stays unanswered. But once it is met with truth, it becomes something else. Connection. I started telling him small stories from his infancy. Things I remembered from those brief moments. How quiet the room became. How I whispered to him even when I was told he could not hear. He listened like every word mattered. Because to him, they did. Sometimes, after he left, I sat alone and reflected. For decades, I had believed my love went nowhere. That it disappeared with a child I never held. Now I knew something important. Love does not disappear. It waits. Not patiently, but faithfully. One day, while looking through old documents, I found my hospital discharge papers. I had not looked at them in years. I read them slowly. So many details. So many signatures. And yet, no mention of holding my child. That absence spoke loudly. I showed them to Daniel when he visited next. He read quietly. "They wrote our story without us," he said. "Yes," I replied. "And then they asked us to live with it." We sat with that truth for a long time. Despite everything, I did not feel bitterness. I felt clarity. Bitterness would have required energy I no longer wanted to give. Clarity allowed me to move forward. My relationship with Daniel's wife deepened as well. She began calling me more often, asking advice, sharing stories. She did not feel threatened by my presence. She welcomed it. That kindness mattered more than she knew. One day, she said, "Our children are lucky. They have more love than they expected." I agreed. Love multiplies when it is honest. As the seasons passed, I found myself thinking less about the word lost. I thought more about the word found. Found peace. Found truth. Found myself again. I had lived many years believing I was incomplete. Now I understood something gently powerful. I was never incomplete. I was waiting. Sometimes, late at night, I still thought about that hospital room. But now, the memory no longer ended in silence. It ended here. With a knock on my door. With a voice saying, "I think you're my mother." And with my hand opening that door. This story did not erase the pain of 30 years. But it gave it meaning. And meaning has a quiet strength of its own. I no longer needed answers to move forward. I had understanding. And that, finally, was enough. As time continued to pass, I began to see my life in a way I never had before. Not as a series of losses. Not as something that had been taken from me. But as a long journey that had asked more of me than I ever expected. And I had walked it. Slowly. Quietly. With more strength than I ever gave myself credit for. Daniel started visiting less often, not because we were drifting apart, but because life was settling into a gentle balance. We no longer needed constant reassurance. We trusted the connection now. Sometimes weeks passed without seeing each other. When we did meet, nothing felt missing. That told me everything. One afternoon, while sitting alone with a cup of tea, I realized something that made me pause. For years, I had measured my love by pain. I believed the depth of my grief proved how deeply I loved. Now, I understood something different. Love does not need pain to prove it exists. It simply needs truth. That realization lifted a quiet weight from my heart. I began volunteering at a small community center nearby. Nothing demanding. Just helping where I could. Listening to people's stories. Offering tea. Sitting beside those who needed company. I noticed something quickly. Everyone carries something they rarely speak about. Loss. Regret. Unanswered questions. And yet, everyone keeps going. That shared humanity made me feel less alone. One day, a young woman sat beside me and said, "I feel like I lost something I never really had." I looked at her and understood immediately. "You're allowed to grieve that," I told her. As the words left my mouth, I realized I was speaking to my younger self. Daniel told me once that finding me changed how he understood his own life. I always felt like a piece of me was missing, he said. Not empty, just unanswered. And now? I asked. Now it feels placed, he replied. Placed. Not fixed. Not perfect. Placed. That word stayed with me. There were moments when I thought about confronting the hospital, asking questions, demanding explanations. But each time, I asked myself why. Not because I was afraid, but because I already had what I needed. Truth. Confrontation would not give me back 30 years. Peace had already given me something better. Release. My days became simpler. Morning light. Evening quiet. Phone calls from Daniel. Visits from grandchildren. I stopped planning far ahead. I focused on now. One evening, as I was preparing dinner, I caught myself humming. I stopped and laughed softly. I could not remember the last time I did that without realizing it. Joy had returned quietly, without permission, without announcement. Daniel once asked me if I wished things had turned out differently. I thought about it carefully. Yes, I said. And no. He smiled. That makes sense, he said. It did. Wishing for a different past did not cancel gratitude for the present. Both could exist. As the years moved forward, I noticed my reflection changing. Lines on my face deepened. Hair grew thinner. But my eyes looked clearer. I no longer carried questions in them. I learned something important through all of this. Sometimes, life gives you answers you never asked for. And sometimes, it takes away questions you thought you needed. I had lived half my life believing my baby died at birth. Then one day, he knocked on my door. And everything I thought I knew about my story shifted. Not violently. Not painfully. Gently. This was never a story about correcting a mistake. It was a story about discovering that even the deepest silence can break. And when it does not always shout. Sometimes, it whispers. I'm here. And that whisper is enough. As that whisper settled into my life, I learned how to listen in a different way. I listened without waiting for answers. I listened without preparing myself for disappointment. I listened the way you do when you trust that whatever comes next will be enough. For so long, I had listened only for loss. Every sound carried the fear of something ending. Now, sound carried presence. The ticking clock in the kitchen. The kettle warming on the stove. The quiet knock when Daniel arrived. These were not reminders of absence anymore. They were signs of life continuing. Daniel once told me that finding me changed how he spoke to his own children. I don't rush through things anymore, he said. I don't assume I'll always have time. I understood that. Loss teaches you urgency. Truth teaches you care. I began to notice how gently my body responded to this new chapter. My shoulders relaxed. My breathing slowed. For years, I carried tension without knowing it. Now, my body was learning what safety felt like again. Not excitement. Not certainty. Safety. One afternoon, while sitting together, Daniel asked me something quietly. Do you ever wish you had held me more? The question surprised me. I held you in my heart every day, I said. And now, I hold you with my presence. He nodded. That's enough, he said. And it was. I stopped explaining my story to people who asked out of curiosity. Instead, I shared it only when it felt right. Not because it was secret, but because it was sacred. Some stories are not meant to be consumed. They are meant to be respected. There were still moments when sadness returned. Like when I saw old photos of newborns. Or heard hospital stories. But sadness no longer felt like a fall. It felt like a wave that passed through and left calm behind. I learned not to fight it. One evening, as the sun set, Daniel stood at the door longer than usual. "I don't know how to thank you," he said. "For what?" I asked. "For opening the door," he replied. "For letting the truth exist." I smiled. "The truth existed long before either of us were ready," I said. "We just finally met it." After he left, I stood alone in the quiet house. I did not feel empty. I felt complete in a way I had never expected. Not because the past was fixed, but because it was finally honest. I think often about that younger version of myself. The woman in the hospital bed. The woman who went home with empty arms. I no longer feel the urge to rescue her. I feel the urge to honor her. She survived something she was never meant to understand. And she kept living anyway. If someone listening to this story feels like life took something from them without explanation, I want to say this. Not everything that disappears is gone forever. And not everything that returns comes back the same. But meaning finds its way in. Quietly. Patiently. I was told my baby died at birth. I lived many years believing that was the end of the story. Then one day, 30 years later, there was a knock at my door. And when I opened it, I did not just meet my son. I met the truth. And with it, I met myself again. As that understanding settled into my days, I noticed something else happening. I stopped living as if I was afraid of the future. For a long time, I treated tomorrow like something fragile. Something that might break if I touched it too hard. Now, tomorrow felt simple. It would come, and I would meet it. That was enough. Daniel's visits became less about catching up and more about sharing life as it was. Sometimes he brought his children. Sometimes he came alone. When the children came, the house filled with movement and sound. Shoes by the door. Laughter in the hallway. I watched them carefully, not with sadness, but with curiosity. They were pieces of him. And somehow, pieces of me. One afternoon, as I watched them draw on the floor, I felt something warm rise in my chest. Not grief. Not regret. Gratitude. Daniel once asked me if I felt cheated by life. The question caught me off guard. I thought about it for a long time. Yes, I said finally. And no. He smiled gently. I think both can be true, he said. He was right. Life took something from me without permission. And then, unexpectedly, it returned something else. Not the same, but meaningful. I began writing again, not for anyone else, but for myself. Not long pages. Just small reflections. Moments that mattered. Thoughts I did not want to forget. Writing helped me see how far I had come. I was no longer the woman waiting for answers. I was the woman living with them. One quiet evening, as I sat alone, I realized something that surprised me. I was no longer afraid of remembering. For years, memory felt dangerous. Like touching a wound that never healed. Now, memory felt like a place I could visit without getting lost. I could remember the pain. And still return to peace. Daniel told me that knowing me changed how he understood forgiveness. I used to think forgiveness meant pretending nothing happened, he said. Now I think it means allowing the truth to exist without letting it destroy you. I nodded. That's exactly what it is, I said. There were moments when people asked if I felt angry at the hospital. I answered honestly. I felt angry once, I said. But anger wanted to stay forever. I chose something else. I chose clarity. As time passed, my days grew quieter. Not empty. Intentional. I learned how to sit with myself without distraction. How to enjoy stillness. For someone who spent years running from silence, this felt like a gift. One morning, I woke up and realized I had not dreamed about the past in weeks. I smiled. Not because the past no longer mattered, but because it no longer demanded my attention. Daniel once said something that made me laugh softly. "If someone told me this story, I wouldn't believe it," he said. I smiled. "Neither would I replied. And yet, here we were, living it. I stopped asking why this happened to me. That question no longer served me. Instead, I asked something else. What will I do with what remains? The answer was simple. I will live gently. I will love honestly. I will rest when I need to. As I grow older, I understand something that once felt impossible. Life does not owe us fairness, but it often gives us meaning. Not loudly, not clearly, but steadily. I was told my baby died at birth. I believed it. For 30 years, that belief shaped my life. Then one day, my son knocked on my door. And when I opened it, I did not step into the past. I stepped into truth. And truth, even when it arrives late, has a way of setting you free. As that freedom settled into me, I realized how gently it asked to be protected. Freedom is not loud. It does not announce itself. It arrives quietly and waits to see if you will trust it. 4 years, I lived as if something terrible might happen again at any moment. As if joy needed permission. As if calm was temporary. Now, I let calm stay. Daniel and I talked one evening about fear. "Were you afraid to open the door?" he asked. "Yes," I said honestly. "Terrified." "Then why did you?" he asked. I thought for a moment. "Because something inside me said this fear was different," I replied. "It wasn't warning me to run. It was asking me to be brave." He nodded slowly. That felt true. I noticed how my relationship with time had changed. I no longer rushed mornings. I no longer worried about nights. Each part of the day had its place. Morning was for light and quiet thoughts. Afternoon for movement and small tasks. Evening for reflection. I stopped filling every hour with purpose. Sometimes, simply being present was enough. One afternoon, Daniel brought me a small box. "I found this among my papers," he said. "I thought you should have it." Inside were copies of adoption documents, notes, signatures, names written by people who never knew how deeply their words would affect us. I did not feel anger reading them. I felt clarity. "This explains the silence," I said. "Yes," he replied. "But it doesn't explain us." I smiled. "No," I said. "It doesn't need to." I learned to separate facts from meaning. The facts were painful. They always would be. But meaning was something I could choose. I chose meaning that did not trap me. Sometimes, Daniel's children asked questions. Simple ones. "Where were you when Dad was little? Why didn't you live together?" I answered gently. Without lies. Without details they did not need. Life was complicated, I said. But love was always there. They accepted that easily. Children often do. One day, as I watched Daniel leave, I noticed something surprising. I did not feel the ache I once expected. I did not feel loss when he walked away. I felt trust. Trust that he would return. Trust that even if he didn't, the connection remained. That was new. I thought often about the word mother. For 30 years, it felt unfinished. Interrupted. Now, it felt quiet and complete. Not because I had regained lost years, but because the truth had found its place. I began to speak to myself differently. Where once I blamed myself for surviving, I now thanked myself for it. I thanked myself for waking up every day. For raising a life when mine felt broken. For choosing softness instead of bitterness. Those choices mattered. One evening, as the house settled into sleep, I sat alone and reflected. This story could have broken me. It almost did. But it also taught me something I never expected to learn. That even when life takes something precious, it does not always take your ability to love again. Sometimes, it hides it. And waits. I no longer feared endings. Endings had once felt final to me. Cruel. Now, I saw them as transitions. The end of grief was not the end of love. The end of waiting was not the end of care. Everything simply changed shape. If you are listening to this and holding on to a pain that feels too old to heal, I want you to know this. Time does not erase pain, but it can soften it enough for truth to enter. And when truth enters, it does not always fix what happened, but it gives you back yourself. I was told my baby died at birth. That belief shaped half my life. Then, 30 years later, my son knocked on my door. And when I opened it, I did not just find him. I found courage. And with it, a peace that no one could take away. As I grew more comfortable with this new truth, I noticed how gently it began to change my memories. Not erase them. Not replace them. But soften their edges. When I thought about the hospital now, I no longer felt only the sharpness of loss. I also felt clarity. I understood that the silence I lived with for so long was not something I imagined. It was something placed upon me. That understanding lifted a weight I did not know I was still carrying. For years, I believed my pain was something I needed to endure quietly. Now I saw it differently. It was something I survived without being given the truth. And surviving without truth takes strength most people never see. Daniel and I began talking more openly about identity. Not just his. Mine too. I grew up knowing I was adopted, he said one afternoon. But I didn't know I was stolen from a story. That word stayed with me. Story. I lived my life thinking my story ended before it began, I replied. But it didn't end. It just went quiet. We sat with that for a while. 2 lives interrupted by decisions made without us. I noticed how often people talk about closure. They imagine it as a door slamming shut. For me, closure felt like a window opening. Letting air in. Letting light enter places that had been closed for too long. Nothing dramatic. Just relief. There were days when anger visited me. Not at Daniel. Not at his family. But at the system that decided silence was kinder than truth. On those days, I let myself feel it. I did not rush to forgiveness. Anger, when acknowledged, does not stay forever. It teaches. Then it leaves. One afternoon, while looking at old photographs, I realized something quietly painful. I had no pictures of myself pregnant. None of me holding a baby. That absence felt loud. Daniel noticed my silence. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "I'm thinking about what was never recorded," I said. "What was erased?" He nodded. "But you're here now," he said. "And so am I." That mattered. As months passed, I began to feel a strange peace about my age. For a long time, I wished this truth had arrived sooner. But now, I understood something important. If it had come earlier, I might not have been strong enough to hold it. Time had prepared me. I stopped seeing myself as a woman who lost 30 years. I saw myself as a woman who carried love through 30 years of silence. That changed everything. Daniel once asked me if I felt like his mother. I smiled softly. "I felt like your mother the moment I knew you existed," I said. "I just wasn't allowed to live it." He reached for my hand. "And now?" he asked. "And now I get to choose how," I replied. As we spent more time together, I noticed how our bond felt different from what I once imagined. It was not intense. It was not desperate. It was grounded. Built on truth, not fantasy. Built on respect, not expectation. That felt healthier than anything I once dreamed of. There were moments when I watched him leave and felt a gentle ache. Not grief. Not loss. Just awareness. Awareness of time. Time we could not reclaim. And yet, time we still had. I learned to sit with that dual truth. Something was taken from me, and something was given back. Both could exist. As the seasons changed, I noticed how my home reflected my inner life. It felt warmer. Lived in. Not because of furniture or decoration, but because I was present in it again. I no longer rushed to fill silence. Silence was no longer an enemy. It was a companion. If someone had asked me years ago who I was, I would have answered quietly, "I'm a woman who lost her child." Now, my answer is different. I'm a woman who found her truth. And that truth did not make my life perfect. It made it honest. As that honesty settled deeper into me, I noticed how differently I carried myself through the day. I walked slower. Not because my body demanded it, but because my mind no longer rushed ahead of my heart. For so many years, I lived in survival mode. Always preparing for the next loss. Always bracing. Now, I moved through my days without armor. And that felt unfamiliar at first. Daniel and I spoke one afternoon about guilt. "Do you ever feel guilty for living your life without me?" he asked carefully. I shook my head. "No," I said. "I felt guilty for surviving when I thought you were gone. That was harder." He nodded. "I used to feel guilty for being alive," he said. "For having a good life when I didn't know where I came from." We looked at each other then, understanding something quietly painful. Guilt grows easily in silence. Truth does not feed it. I began to see how many of my habits were shaped by fear. Fear of attachment. Fear of disappointment. I kept people at a careful distance. Not cold. Just guarded. Now, I let myself be closer. Not to everyone, but to those who earned it. One evening, Daniel told me something that surprised me. "I used to dream about you," he said. "Not your face. Just a presence." I felt my throat tighten. "I dreamed of you too," I said. "But only as a feeling. Never a face." We both smiled softly. Love remembers, even when memory cannot. As weeks turned into months, I noticed how the word mother changed inside me. For decades, it carried sorrow. A quiet ache. Now, it carried steadiness. Not urgency. Not desperation. Belonging. There were days when my body felt tired in a way that had nothing to do with age. On those days, I rested without explanation. I no longer felt the need to justify my pauses. Rest was not avoidance. It was care. I spent more time with Daniel's children. Listening to their stories. Watching their expressions. They did not see me as someone from the past. They saw me as someone present. That mattered. One of them once asked, "Were you scared when Dad was born?" I smiled gently. "Yes," I said. "And hopeful." They nodded, as if that explained everything. Daniel's wife and I grew more comfortable with each other. There was no competition between us. No unspoken tension. Just respect. One day, she said something I did not expect. "I'm glad he knows where he comes from," she said. "Everyone deserves that." I thanked her quietly. Her grace made space for all of us. I noticed how my memories began rearranging themselves. The painful ones no longer stood in the center. They moved to the edges. They were still there, but they no longer controlled the picture. One afternoon, I found myself standing in front of a mirror, studying my reflection. I did not search for the woman I used to be. I looked at the woman I had become. Someone steadier. Someone softer. Someone who had survived without becoming hard. That felt like an achievement. I thought about all the versions of myself that existed through the years. The young woman in the hospital bed. The grieving mother who learned to stay quiet. The older woman who opened the door. All of them lived inside me. None of them were wasted. Daniel once asked me if I wished I had another child after losing him. I thought carefully. I wished for many things, I said. But life gave me what it could. He nodded. And now? He asked. And now, I replied. I feel complete. That surprised me. For years, completeness felt like a myth. Something people talked about but never reached. Now, I understood it differently. Completeness does not mean having everything you wanted. It means making peace with what you have lived. There were evenings when Daniel and I sat together and said very little. Those moments felt important. No explanations. No revisiting. Just shared presence. That kind of connection does not need words. I stopped replaying conversations in my head. I stopped wondering if I had said the right thing. I trusted myself now. That trust felt like freedom. As I look back, I see how my life was shaped by one sentence. Your baby did not survive. For 30 years, that sentence defined me. Now, it no longer does. The truth changed the shape of my story, not by erasing pain, but by giving it context. I am no longer a woman frozen in a moment of loss. I am a woman moving forward with truth. And truth, even when it arrives late, has a way of restoring dignity. As dignity returned to my life, I noticed how differently I spoke to myself. For years, my inner voice was harsh. Always questioning. Always blaming. Why didn't you fight harder? Why didn't you ask more questions? Why did you accept silence so easily? Now, that voice softened. I began speaking to myself the way I would speak to someone I loved. You did what you could. You survived what you were given. You stayed kind. Those words mattered. Daniel and I spoke one evening about memory. I don't remember being born, he said. But sometimes I feel like my body remembers something. I understood that. Trauma does not always live in the mind. Sometimes it settles quietly in the body. I think our bodies knew the truth before we did, I said. He nodded. That's why I always felt unfinished, he replied. As I listened to him speak about his childhood, I noticed something new. There was no bitterness in him. No anger that demanded answers. Just curiosity. That told me a lot about the life he had lived. Love does not erase questions, but it keeps them from becoming wounds. I began thinking about legacy, not in terms of property or names, but in terms of presence. What did I want to leave behind? I wanted to leave behind honesty, gentleness, the courage to face truth, even when it comes late. One afternoon, Daniel asked me if I would like to visit the hospital where I gave birth. The question surprised me. I sat quietly before answering. I don't know, I said. Not yet. He nodded. There's no rush, he said. That mattered. For 30 years, everything had felt rushed. Decisions made quickly. Silence enforced quickly. Now, nothing needed to be rushed. As months passed, my relationship with time continued to change. I no longer measured it by loss. I measured it by connection. How many mornings I woke up calm. How many evenings I went to sleep without heaviness. Those were my markers now. Sometimes, I thought about the nurses, the doctors. I wondered if they remembered me, if they remembered the young woman who asked to see her baby and was told no. But then I realized something. Their memory of me did not matter. Mine did. I spent an afternoon organizing old papers, birth records, marriage certificates, letters. I placed them neatly into folders. For years, I avoided those things. Now, I handled them without shaking. That felt like progress. Daniel once said something that made me pause. I don't feel angry anymore, he said. I feel complete. That word again. Complete. It followed us. One evening, we spoke about names. My adoptive parents chose my name carefully, he said. But knowing the name you gave me feels different. It doesn't replace anything, I replied. It just adds to it. He smiled. Yes, he said. That's exactly how it feels. I noticed how easily laughter returned to my life. Not loud laughter. Soft moments. A shared smile. A gentle joke. For years, laughter felt like betrayal. As if smiling meant forgetting. Now, I understood something important. Laughter does not erase memory. It honors survival. I thought often about women like me. Women who were told not to ask questions. Women whose pain was managed instead of acknowledged. I wished I could sit beside each of them and say one thing. You were not wrong to feel something was missing. Daniel's presence changed how I understood motherhood. Motherhood is not only about years spent together. It is about connection that survives separation. It is about love that waits. As I aged, I felt my priorities shift. I cared less about being understood by everyone. I cared more about being at peace with myself. That was enough. One quiet night, as rain tapped gently against the windows, I sat alone and reflected. If my baby had truly died that day, my life would have still mattered. And now that he lived, my life mattered in a different way. Both truths could exist. That understanding brought me calm. I was told my baby died at birth. That belief shaped me. Then, 30 years later, my son knocked on my door. And when I opened it, I did not become someone new. I became more myself. As I became more myself, I noticed how little I needed to prove anything anymore. For a long time, I felt like I had to justify my life. My choices. My silence. Now, I felt no such need. My life had spoken for itself. Daniel once asked me what I would say to my younger self if I could. I thought about it for a long time. I would tell her not to doubt her instincts, I said. She knew something was wrong. She wasn't imagining it. He nodded. That matters, he said. It did. So many of us are taught to doubt our inner voice, especially when it makes others uncomfortable. I began paying attention to my instincts again. Not fear-based ones, but the quiet ones. The ones that tell you when to rest, when to speak, when to let something go. Those instincts had never failed me. I just stopped listening to them for a while. One afternoon, Daniel arrived looking thoughtful. I was thinking about something, he said. I waited. If you hadn't opened the door, he continued. I don't know if I would have tried again. My chest tightened. I almost didn't, I admitted. He smiled softly. I'm glad you did. So was I. That single choice had changed everything. I reflected often on how close I came to closing that door forever. Not because I was cruel, but because I was afraid. Fear protects us, but it can also imprison us. That day, I chose courage without knowing the outcome. I chose to listen instead of retreat. That choice became a turning point. As the seasons passed, I felt myself growing gentler with age. Not weaker, gentler. I spoke slower, listened longer. I did not interrupt silence anymore. Silence often carried what words could not. Daniel and I spoke about forgiveness one evening. Do you forgive the people who lied? He asked. I thought carefully. I don't forgive or condemn, I said. I release. He nodded. That felt right. Holding judgment would only keep me tied to them. Release gave me back my energy. I noticed how my dreams changed. For years, my dreams were filled with searching, calling out, waking up breathless. Now, my dreams were quiet, ordinary, walking, talking, sitting in sunlight. That told me my mind had finally found rest. I started enjoying small rituals, watering plants in the morning, folding laundry slowly. These tasks grounded me. They reminded me that life continues in simple ways. Daniel once said something that made me smile. "You taught me patience without meaning to," he said. "How?" I asked. "By surviving without answers," he replied. I hadn't thought of it that way. Survival itself had become a lesson. I thought about how many years I spent waiting for pain to lessen. I didn't realize pain doesn't lessen on its own. Understanding lessens it. Truth softens it. And time makes room for both. As my body slowed with age, my mind felt lighter. I carried fewer questions. I carried fewer regrets. I carried more acceptance. One evening, while sitting alone, I realized something gently powerful. I no longer needed this story to make sense to anyone else. It made sense to me. That was enough. I sometimes imagined how my life would have unfolded if the truth had never come. I would have continued living. Quietly. Bravely. That realization brought me peace. My strength was never dependent on reunion. When Daniel visits now, we do not fill the time. We share it. Sometimes with words. Sometimes without. Both feel complete. I stopped fearing the end of my life. Not because I wanted it to come, but because I trusted what I had lived. I had loved. I had endured. I had chosen kindness. That felt like a full story. I was told my baby died at birth. That belief shaped decades of my life. Then, 30 years later, my son knocked on my door. And when I opened it, I learned something important. Truth does not arrive to undo your life. It arrives to return you to it. As I settled more fully into this stage of my life, I began to understand something about endings that I had never understood before. Endings are not always about loss. Sometimes they are about release. For years, I feared the idea of things ending. I feared conversations ending, relationships ending, even days ending. Endings reminded me of that hospital room, of being told something was over before it had even begun. Now, endings felt different. They felt like gentle pauses. Places where you can breathe before continuing in a new way. Daniel and I spoke one evening about how strange it was that we met when we did. "Do you think it happened at the right time?" he asked. I thought carefully. "Yes," I said. "Not because it was fair, but because I was ready." He nodded. "I don't think I would have known what to do with this truth when I was younger," he said. Neither would I. Time had given us language. It had given us patience. And it had given us the ability to sit with discomfort without running from it. I began thinking about the word home. For a long time, home felt fragile to me, like something that could be taken away at any moment. Now, home felt internal. It was the way I moved through my thoughts, the way I treated my memories. Home was no longer a place I feared losing. I noticed how people spoke to me differently now. Not because they knew my story, but because I carried myself differently. I listened without urgency. I spoke without needing agreement. That kind of calm changes how people respond to you. One afternoon, while sitting alone, I found myself thanking my younger self again. Not for being strong, but for staying open. Despite everything, she did not close her heart completely. She learned to survive without becoming bitter. That mattered more than I ever realized. Daniel once asked me what I hoped for now. The question surprised me. "I don't hope for big things anymore," I said. I hope for ordinary peace. He smiled. That sounds like the biggest thing of all, he said. It did. As the years continue, I feel less pressure to define my role in anyone's life. I am not trying to replace anyone. I am not trying to reclaim time. I am simply present. Presence is enough. Sometimes I imagine the hospital staff from that night, all those years ago. I imagine them making decisions quickly, thinking they were protecting me. I do not hate them. I understand that fear makes people choose silence. But I also understand now that silence has consequences. That understanding no longer hurts. It simply informs me. I have become gentler with other people too. When someone avoids a subject, when someone changes the topic, I no longer judge. I know how heavy unspoken things can feel. Daniel's children asked me once what advice I would give them for life. I thought about it carefully. Listen to your instincts, I said. And ask questions when something doesn't feel right. They nodded seriously. That felt important. I think often about how different my life might look from the outside. Some might see it as tragic. Some might see it as miraculous. I see it as human. Full of uncertainty. Full of resilience. As my days grow quieter, I have learned to appreciate that quiet. Not as emptiness, but as space. Space to remember without pain. Space to feel without fear. I no longer need this story to resolve perfectly. It does not need a dramatic ending. It already gave me what I needed. Truth. Connection. Peace. I was told my baby died at birth. That belief shaped who I became. Then, 30 years later, my son knocked on my door. And when I opened it, I learned something simple and powerful. Life does not always return what it takes. But sometimes, it returns understanding. And understanding can be enough. As I reached this point in my life, I began to think less about what my story meant and more about how it felt to live inside it. For many years, my life felt like something that happened to me. Like a current I was carried by, without choice. Now, it felt like something I was walking through. Slowly. Intentionally. That change mattered. I stopped waiting for signs that I was doing things right. For a long time, I looked for reassurance in other people's words. In their approval. In their understanding. Now, reassurance came from inside. If something felt peaceful, I trusted it. If it felt heavy, I stepped back. That simple rule guided me better than any advice ever had. Daniel and I talked one evening about the idea of being too late. I used to think everything important in life had already happened, he said. That I arrived too late to matter. I looked at him and shook my head. Nothing important arrives too late, I said. It arrives when we are ready to receive it. He smiled quietly. I noticed how differently I experienced gratitude now. Before, gratitude felt forced. Like something I was supposed to feel, even when I was hurting. Now, gratitude came naturally. Not for what was taken, but for what remained. Morning light. A calm breath. A voice I could finally call my son's. There were days when my body reminded me of my age. A stiffness in my joints. A slower pace. I did not fight it. I welcomed it as proof that I was still here. Still moving forward. I began telling my story less often. Not because it no longer mattered, but because it had settled into me. Some stories need to be spoken to be released. Others need to be lived quietly once they are understood. One afternoon, Daniel sat beside me and said something that made me pause. I don't feel like I'm filling a gap anymore, he said. I feel like I belong. That word stayed with me. Belong. For so long, neither of us felt it fully. Now, it rested gently between us. I thought about the concept of justice. For years, I believed justice meant correcting what went wrong, holding someone accountable, demanding answers. Now, I saw justice differently. Justice was being able to live honestly after being lied to. Justice was not letting bitterness define the rest of my life. That felt like a quiet victory. As I look ahead, I do not see a future filled with grand plans. I see days. Simple ones. Days where I wake up calm. Days where I speak kindly. Days where I rest without guilt. Those days feel precious. I no longer fear forgetting. For a long time, forgetting felt like betrayal. As if letting go meant losing love. Now, I understand that forgetting pain does not mean forgetting meaning. What mattered stayed with me. What hurt me softened. Daniel once asked me if I was afraid of losing him again. The question surprised me. I'm not afraid, I said. I trust that whatever time we have will be enough. He nodded. That trust felt earned. I began to notice how often people confuse peace with emptiness. Peace is not empty. It is full of acceptance, full of understanding, full of quiet strength. As I sit here now, reflecting on everything that has unfolded, I feel something I never thought I would feel again. Wholeness. Not because my life followed the path I imagined, but because I stopped fighting the path it took. I was told my baby died at birth. That belief shaped decades of my life. Then, 30 years later, my son knocked on my door. And when I opened it, I did not receive a miracle. I received the truth. And the truth did not change my past. It changed how I carried it. This is where my story finds its rest. Not in answers. Not in explanations. But in peace. And peace, after everything, is more than enough.